Subcommittee will come to order. We're pleased to welcome today our distinguished panel to review the fiscal year 2019 budget request for the Department of Defense. Today, the committee will hear from the Honorable James Mattis, Secretary of Defense, and General Joseph Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We know that you got a lot of ground to cover, Mr. Secretary. I'd like for my opening statement to be part of the record where you could get to your statement and we could get to our questions. Senator Durbin.
I ask unanimous consent that my opening statement also be included in the record and defer to our witnesses.
Without objection. Statement will be made part of the record in its entirety. You proceed as you wish.
Well, thank you, Chairman Shelby, Ranking Member Durbin, and distinguished members of the committee, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2019, joined by the Chairman, General Dunford, but also the Department's Comptroller, Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Norquist, and thank you for accepting my written statement. For the record, I'm now in my second year as Secretary of Defense, and with this committee's help, we have made steady progress during the past 15 months. I must also note that this is my first time to testify before you as Chairman Shelby, and congratulations on that leadership position in the Pentagon. It sent a note of confidence through our ranks. Thank you. Yesterday, President Trump announced the administration's decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, terminating U.S. participation and reimposing sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will continue to work alongside our allies and partners to ensure that Iran can never acquire a nuclear weapon, and will work with others to address the range of Iran's malign influence. This administration remains committed to putting the safety, interests, and well-being of our citizens first. In January, the Department published the 2018 National Defense Strategy, the first in a decade. Framed within President Trump's national security strategy, the 2018 National Defense Strategy provides clear direction for America's military to restore its competitive edge in an era of re-emerging long-term great power competition. The Department next released the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, which calls for America's military to provide a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent that is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats and to reassure our allies. In South Asia and Afghanistan, uncertainty in the region has been replaced by the certainty of the administration's South Asia strategy. Concurrently in the Middle East, we have dramatically reduced ISIS physical caliphate using a coordinated whole-of-government approach that works by, with, and through our allies and partners to crush ISIS' claim of invincibility and to deny them a geographic haven from which to plot murder. 2 months ago, thanks to the bipartisan support and the political courage of Congress and the dedication of this committee, President Trump signed the omnibus spending bill that funds the government for the remainder of the fiscal year. This law, along with the 2-year budget agreement passed as part of February's Budget Bipartisan Act, finally freed us from the inefficient and damaging continuing resolution funding process and is now providing the predictable and sufficient funding needed to continue implementing the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Our fiscal year 2019 budget requests the resources necessary to fulfill the Department's enduring mission to provide the combat-credible military forces needed to deter war and, if deterrence fails, to win in any conflict. These forces reinforce America's traditional tools of diplomacy, ensuring that the President and our diplomats negotiate from a position of strength. To restore our nation's competitive military advantage, the FY19 budget funds our National Defense Strategy's 3 overarching lines of effort: to build a more lethal force, second, to strengthen our traditional alliances while building new partnerships, and third, to reform the Department's business practices for performance and affordability. In regard to our first line of effort to build a more lethal force, all our Department's policies, expenditures, and training must contribute to the lethality of our military. We cannot expect success fighting tomorrow's conflicts with yesterday's thinking, yesterday's weapons, or yesterday's equipment. As President Washington said during his first State of the Union address, to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. So today, members of the committee, our lethal military arm is designed to enhance our diplomats' persuasiveness. The paradox of war is that an adversary will always move against any perceived weakness, so we cannot adopt a single preclusive form of warfare. We must be able to fight across the entire spectrum of combat. The nation must field sufficient capable forces to deter conflict. If deterrence fails, we must win. Following this logic, we must maintain a credible nuclear deterrent so these weapons are never used, and a decisive conventional force that includes irregular warfare capability. Preserving the full range of our nation's deterrent options requires the recapitalization of our Cold War legacy nuclear deterrent forces as initiated during the previous administration. Modernizing the nation's nuclear delivery systems and our nuclear command and control is our department's top priority, and these programs are fully funded in the 2019 budget. That budget funds enhancements to the U.S. missile defense capability to defend the homeland, defend our deployed forces, allies, and partners against an increasingly complex missile threat. In accordance with the soon-to-be-released 2018 Missile Defense Review, this budget requests continued robust support for missile defense capability and the capability that will keep pace with advancing threats. The proposed budget will modestly increase the end strength of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to restore readiness, adding a total of 25,900 to the active and reserve force. The budget will also continue to invest in the military's most important asset, its warfighters, with a 2.6% military pay increase, and the 2019 budget continues increased procurement of preferred and advanced munitions, a necessity due to the ongoing operations in the Middle East and due to the need for war reserves. 10 combat ships and 8 support ships are funded, arresting the downward trajectory of our Navy's size and lethality. We will continue production of 77 F-35s and 24 F/A-18 aircraft, evaluating the performance of both to determine the most appropriate mix moving forward. The budget request funds systems to enhance communications and resiliency in space, addressing overhead persistent infrared capabilities, and also positioning, navigation, and timing. Our 2018 National Defense Strategy also prioritizes investing in technological innovation to increase lethality, specifically cyber, advanced computing, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, autonomy, robotics, miniaturization, additive manufacturing, directed energy, and hypersonics are the very technology that we need to fight and win wars of the future. Every investment in the strategy-driven FY 2019 budget is designed to contribute to the lethality of our military, ensuring that subsequent Secretaries of Defense inherit a military force that is fit for its time. Those seeking to threaten America's experiment in democracy should know that if you challenge us, it will be your longest and worst day. Our 2018 National Defense Strategy's second line of effort remains to strengthen traditional alliances while building new partnerships. In the past, I had the privilege of fighting many times in defense of the United States, but I never fought in a solely American formation. It was always alongside foreign troops. Easier said than done. Winston Churchill noted the only thing harder than fighting with allies is fighting without them. But history proves that we are stronger when we stand united with others. Accordingly, our military will be designed, trained, and ready to fight alongside allies. Working by, with, and through allies and partners who carry their fair share remains a source of strength for the United States. Since the costly victory in World War II, Americans have carried a disproportionate share of the global defense burden while others recovered. Today, the growing economic strength of allies and partners has enabled them to step up, as demonstrated by the 74 nations and international organizations participating in the Defeat ISIS campaign, and again in the 41 nations now standing shoulder to shoulder in NATO's Resolute Support mission in Afghanistan. This year, every NATO ally has increased defense spending, and 15 NATO allies are increasing their defense budgets as a share of gross domestic product, giving credence to the value of democracies standing together. Further, our Pacific partners are also strengthening their defenses. Our third line of effort is the urgent reform of the Department's business practices to provide both solvency and security to the nation. We will continue to establish a culture of performance where results and accountability matter on every expenditure to gain full strength from every single taxpayer dollar spent on defense. We are committed to exercising the utmost degree of financial stewardship and budget discipline within the Department. In this regard, this year we will deliver our Department's first full financial audit in our history. We will find problems and then take swift action to correct our deficiencies, thereby earning the trust of Congress and the American people. I am confident we have the right leaders in place to make meaningful reform a reality. Pat Shanahan as Deputy Secretary of Defense, Jay Gibson as the Chief Management Officer, Ellen Lord as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions and Sustainment, Michael Griffin as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, Bob Daigle as Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, and David Norquist, who joins us here today as the Department's Chief Financial Officer. Each brings the intellect, energy, and experience required to implement and sustain meaningful reform, ensuring the Department provides performance and affordability for the American taxpayer. The Department is transitioning to a culture of performance and affordability that operates at the speed of relevance. We will prioritize speed of delivery, continuous adaptation, and frequent modular upgrades. With your continued critical support, we will shed outdated management and acquisition processes while adopting American industry's best practices. Our management structure and processes are not engraved in stone. They are a means to an end. If current structures inhibit our pursuit of lethality, I have directed service secretaries and agency heads to consolidate, eliminate, or restructure to achieve their mission. The 2018 National Defense Strategy's three primary lines of effort, a more lethal force, strengthening our alliances, and reforming the Department's business practices, will restore our competitive military advantage, ensuring we are prepared to fight across the full spectrum of combat, both now and in the future. I want to thank this committee for your strong spirit of bipartisan collaboration. While our trajectory is going in the right direction, our work has just begun. This is a year of opportunity and a chance to continue to work together, building on a strong start as we turn the 2018 National Defense Strategy into action. The point I need to emphasize in today's hearing are that the budget, which is designed to execute this strategy of building a more lethal force, restoring current and future readiness, and modernizing our nuclear deterrent forces, also must build for the future by improving our military's technological competitive edge and reforming the Department's business processes to establish that culture of performance and affordability that will ensure security and solvency. The strategy is the guidepost for all our actions, including this year's strategy-driven budget request, driving meaningful reform to establish an enduring culture of performance, affordability, and agility. I cannot appear before you, Mr. Chairman, without expressing my gratitude to the men and women of the Department of Defense. They are the ones who must ultimately turn the National Defense Strategy into action. Every day, more than 2 million service members and nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, honoring previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for their country. It is a privilege to serve alongside them, and I thank them for their tireless efforts and unyielding standards in defense of our nation. General Dunford is prepared to discuss the military dimensions of this budget request.
Secretary General Dunford.
Chairman Shelby, Vice Chairman Durbin, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis and Undersecretary Norquist. It's an honor to represent your men and women in uniform. While we're here for a candid discussion of the challenges we face, I want to begin by assuring you that the U.S. military has a competitive advantage over any potential adversary today. I'm confident we can deter a nuclear attack, defend the homeland, meet our alliance commitments, and prevail in any conflict. But as we have previously discussed, after years of sustained operational commitments, budgetary instability, and advances by our adversaries, our competitive advantage has eroded and our readiness has degraded. Driven by the National Defense Strategy and building on the FY17 and 18 appropriations, the 19 budget submission supports rebuilding the lethal and ready force that the nation needs. The Secretary has addressed our defense strategy that recognizes Russia and China as the priority, while also meeting the immediate challenges posed by rogue regimes and violent extremist organizations. China and Russia continue to invest across the full range of nuclear, cyber, space, and conventional capabilities. Both states are focused on limiting our ability to project power and undermining the credibility of our alliances. They are also increasingly adept at advancing their interests through coercive, competitive activity below the threshold of armed conflict. North Korea has been on a relentless pursuit of nuclear and missile capability, and have been clear that these capabilities are intended to threaten the United States and our allies in the region. Iran continues to spread malign influence and create instability across the Middle East. And while we have made a great deal of progress, and the Secretary outlined that in his remarks, we are still grappling with the challenges of violent extremism, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and associated movements. Defending our homeland and our allies and advancing our interests in the context of these and other challenges requires us to maintain a balanced force of ready, lethal, and flexible forces that are relevant across the range of military operations. Fortunately, with your support, we've begun to arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage, and we're on a path towards developing a force that the nation needs. This year's budget again builds on the readiness recovery that we started in fiscal year 17 and accelerates our efforts to develop the capabilities we need for both today and tomorrow. In requesting your support for this year's budget, I, along with all the uniformed leaders in the department, commit to you that we'll make every dollar count. We fully support the auditing initiative led by Secretary Norquist, and we'll maintain an ongoing dialogue with you about the return on your investment. To restore our competitive advantage and ensure our men and women never find themselves in a fair fight, the U.S. military requires sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. The funding in this budget is sufficient, and I look forward to working with the Congress to make sure that it's sustained and predictable in the future. Thank you again for your support and the opportunity to be here today.
Mr. Secretary, first of all, I have a number of questions, but I'd like to submit them for the record where we can move on. But I'd like for you to discuss what you can in this setting, as a public setting, dealing with Iran and also North Korea, what you can do.
Yes, sir. In regards to Iran, they continue their malign activities across the region. Assad is still in power today, still murdering his own people, and still creating refugee flows that we've not seen before based on the support out of Iran. Without it, he would have fallen to his own people's revolt against him. At the same time, we see Iran's activities from Yemen to Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, obviously up into Lebanon, and it continues apace. We have not seen any drawdown or reduction in Iran's malicious activities and malign activities across the region. At the same time, we have walked away from the JCPOA because we found it was inadequate for the long-term effort. And this was something that was probably noted by the Senate several years ago when the Senate did not endorse it as a treaty. So we will work with our allies and try to bring Iran back into more responsible behavior, at the same time addressing all 5 of the threats that Iran constitutes. The nuclear issue, which is foremost, certainly the terrorism issue that I just cited, the ballistic missile efforts they have, cyber attacks they've been conducting, and then the threats to to international commerce, whether it be out of the Red Sea, where we have seen it most recently, or back up in the Persian Gulf, where it has relented over the last several months. So that's basically where we're at vis-a-vis Iran.
What's the upside of breaking out of the agreement with Iran, and what's the downside as you see it?
Yes, sir. I believe what's happened is the President could not affirm as required that this agreement was being lived up to and in the best interest in all aspects of what was supposed to be happening under the JCPOA. In that regard, there was a bona fide, as you know, it was not a hasty decision. The administration's been in place for over a year, and for over a year we have attempted to work with allies to address the shortcomings on it. So I think we now have the opportunity to move forward to address those shortcomings and make it more compelling. So that effort is underway already with Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and others working the issue.
You want to get into North Korea?
With North Korea, sir, certainly their capability concerns us on the military side. However, we see there is some reason for optimism. We said all along this was a diplomatically led effort, backed up by military force. But for right now, Secretary Pompeo is airborne, bringing home the 3 released American citizens as we speak. They've launched out of Pyongyang on their way back to the United States. And I think there is reason for some optimism that these talks could be fruitful.
Senator Durbin.
First, thanks to you, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, and all of those who have gathered with you today for your service to our country. We're lucky to have you. And thank you for all the sacrifices you're making personally to make certain that we are a safe nation. Let me say at the outset that President Trump's decision yesterday to basically exit the United States from this Iran nuclear agreement, I believe, is not only wrong but reckless. We are in a situation where we have had under this agreement inspectors on the ground who have reported to us directly and personally in the United States Senate the success of their inspection regime to make certain that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon. By walking away from this agreement, we are forsaking the opportunity to continue to monitor in detail the work done by Iran to make certain that they live up to its terms. Equally important, and you've acknowledged it, our allies are important to us around the world. Our allies joined us in sticking their necks out. France, Germany, UK, the European Union, China and Russia joining us to make certain that this agreement had a kind of universal support beyond Iran. And now the United States is walking away from it. That, I cannot believe, will inspire any confidence among our allies about our word and our reliability in the future when it comes to these agreements. And I know you've commented on this already, and I won't call on you to do it again unless you wish. The second point I'd like to make is you're about to make history this year and again next year. You'll have the largest budget of any department ever in the history of the United States of America, the largest. And you'll see an increase this year and another next year that is virtually unprecedented. That gives you a great opportunity to do great things, but as you have noted in your testimony, it also invites some unwelcome consequences, whether we're talking about waste of taxpayers' dollars, fraud, or misuse of those dollars, which could damage the reputation of your mission and the men and women who are dedicated to it. I know you are personally committed to avoid that and are talking about things like procurement reform as part of it, but I think you have a special burden. There was a burden when you had too few dollars. There'll be an additional burden when you have so many dollars coming in so quickly. The third point I'd like to ask a question about is one that we've talked about last year, and I wanted to revisit. You referred in your testimony to the certainty of the administration's South Asian strategy, and I would like to focus in on what is happening in Afghanistan. The President's new South Asian strategy increases U.S. military personnel to 15,000, takes a tougher line with Pakistan, and increases our outreach to India. Meanwhile, suicide bombs continue to savage Kabul, And the new Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction issues a report that paints a very bleak picture about the future of our involvement in what has become the longest war in the history of the United States of America. A few statistics. After $126 billion U.S. relief and reconstruction investment over the last 20 years, Afghanistan ranks 183rd among nations in the world where one would want to do business. Less than a third of the people of Afghanistan are connected to the power grid. The number of bombs dropped by the Western Coalition in Afghanistan in early 2018 was the highest number since the year 2013, and the number of direct Taliban attacks declined over the winter. However, only 65% of the population presently lives under Afghan government control, after direct U.S. expenditures to Afghan security forces of $78 billion. This report that I referred to projects that the overall trend for the insurgency is rising. Suicide attacks in Afghanistan up 50% in 2017. Casualties from complex attacks and suicide bombing steadily rising. Sectarian attacks tripled in 2017. Recent media reports indicate the 1st Security Forces Assistance Brigade deployed to Afghanistan in March is facing serious delays due to problems vetting Afghan National Army personnel, despite all of our efforts at training and despite the massive investment by the United States. Last year, I asked you for an assessment of the civilian and military situation in this Afghan war, and today, by the Inspector General's report, all of the indicators that he gives are negative. When is it reasonable for the United States of America to expect that the administration's certainty, as you call it, in their South Asian strategy will actually show success?
Senator Durbin, first, on the amount of money we've been given, it's sobering as we look at the sacrifice of money that could be used elsewhere in our society. It's sobering to realize this much sacrifice is providing us the budget certainty. But that also means that solvency and security have got to go hand in hand. And I would just tell you that the audit, the financial audit that we have going on, and it's going to happen this year, first time in 70 years, we are going to find the problems. I'm going to celebrate every one of them. We're going to fix them. And when we get done, we're going to show you that we can spend this money wisely. I'm not out for perfection, but in this regard, sir, I'm going to be both impatient and intolerant of any misbehavior with the public money, and I will work with you. We'll be open with what we find, and I know you'll be forthcoming to me when you find problems, and we'll work on it. On Afghanistan, this goes to the very heart of the world we live in today. The certainty was one where we were realigning our forces to purely advisory duties, with the exception of a few counterterrorism strike forces, which continue their mission, and ensuring that we also had more allies coming with us. We've gone from 50 allies down to 39. We restored 2, and both those are Muslim nations, by the way. We're up to 41. The realignment and the reinforcement, U.S. and other nations, the Germans are bringing in, basically raising their numbers by 35%. At the same time, it's not going to all be carried by us. Going through India on my way into Afghanistan on one of my first trips, Prime Minister Modi basically committed to a very high level of development funding. My point here is we're also regionalizing this effort so that it's not all carried by our taxpayers, by our soldiers. Probably the most difficult aspect of this, and I would contest a few of the figures you gave me, Senator, but not all of them. I think the theme is what you're driving at. Progress and violence coexist in Afghanistan. And in that regard, the Taliban recognizes they cannot win at the ballot box. So they went to bombs. We anticipated it. We've stopped a large number of these attacks. But you'll notice the attacks right now are addressed to soft targets, is what we'd call them, by and large. The reason is they are being rebuffed by the Afghan forces and the coalition forces. And furthermore, they are trying to set a condition that would wear our patience thin. That's why they're going after the balloting and the election, where you sign up for elections, the registration sites. That's why they're going after high visibility efforts here. So our point right now is that as we find more ability, and we are going to find it, we're going to vet the troops that we are working with. We're not just going to send our troops out to work with people who have not been vetted. But as we find those units and we start having more NATO advisors with them, mostly American, but other NATO countries as well, then we will end up with more capable units in the field. The American advised units, commandos and special forces, over the last several years have not been defeated in combat with the Taliban. Those that were not mentored by our units were being defeated. So that's why we realigned to this approach. It's going to take a fighting season. This fighting season is underway. The number of enemy-initiated attacks where they had the initiative is down by 17% over last year. So who's initiating the attack is as important as the number of attacks. Where we're ambushing them, where we're starting the fight, that means we have the initiative. It's going to take time, Senator, and I don't refute that this has been a long fight. I first landed there in November of 2001. I recognize how long it's been. But I think, too, as you look at what we stand for in this world, the idea that attacks on registration places for elections, that's not something that should drive us out of this fight, sir.
Senator Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. Norquist. Mr. Secretary, you and the General have spent most of your life in the service of your country, and I want to thank you for continuing to do so. I noticed that when you come to Capitol Hill, you're invited to speak to the Democratic caucus as well as to the Republican caucus, so we have a lot of confidence in you as a source of stability and good advice for us. And I think that is one major reason why the funding levels for this year and for next year are so much higher. I want to talk to you about the nuclear posture review. The Department of Defense is the lead author for that. I voted for the New START Treaty in 2010 with Russia, which in general reduced the number of nuclear weapons in the world. I thought we had enough if we made sure that the ones we continue to have work. And I'm chairman of the subcommittee, Energy and Water, along with Senator Feinstein, that provides the money for modernization of our nuclear weapons. And over that period of time, we've kept our commitments to do that. I noticed that the nuclear posture review calls for the development of 2 low-yield nuclear weapons to be deployed on submarines. And I want to ask you about that. The idea would be to use $65 million to modify the remaining portion of the W-76 Warhead Life Extension Program. My questions are, is this a new nuclear weapon? Is that consistent with the direction we've been going over the last several years of reducing the number of nuclear weapons? Do you believe Russia has increased the role of its nuclear weapons over the last decade in its doctrine and planning? Do you believe that our investing in our own low-yield nuclear weapons would help deter Russia from using nuclear weapons in certain instances? So basically, what's the justification for developing 2 new low-yield nuclear weapons?
Senator Alexander, thank you for your mention of the bipartisan nature of the support we are getting in the Department of Defense. We recognize it, and we recognize the responsibility to maintain open communications across the House and the Senate. No reservations whatsoever, and we wouldn't be where we're at without, I would even call it political courage in order to pass the omnibus. We recognize many took risk on their reelection. In terms of the number of strategic weapons, there is no increase. The reason we want to reduce the yield of several of those weapons on the submarines is, frankly, the bellicose statements and cavalier statements coming out of Moscow, even to the point of talking about escalation to de-escalate. In other words, a conventional fight that they would initiate wouldn't be going well, so they would escalate to a low-yield nuclear weapon, knowing that our choice would be to either respond with a high yield or surrender. In other words, frankly, suicide or surrender, because a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States would be a disaster for this planet and certainly for our countries. So there's no increase in the numbers. We need to make certain that we can checkmate any thought that they could escalate to de-escalate so these weapons are never used. And I think that we have seen and heard Russian talk about offensive actions to include the video, the pre-election video by Mr. Putin that would show a degree of cavalier discussion about nuclear weapons that we would never have seen in his predecessors. And as such, we are responding to make certain our deterrent is fit for its time, not creating a war-fighting capability. To me, it's got to be able to be used so it's never used, is our point.
Okay.
And I didn't see anything he said in that video, by the way, that changed my strategic calculus that would have me coming back a month from now asking to raise the number of strategic weapons.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to submit a question for the record involving a small defense contractor in Tennessee that's suddenly found in violation of the Berry Amendment because they sourced parts for the zippers they make in Tennessee from overseas. We thought it was an incidental matter for 16 years. It hasn't been a problem. Suddenly it's a problem and threatens to put a bunch of people out of work. So I'll submit a letter on that.
Okay.
My last question is this, and goes to something. We have here the chairman, we have the Democratic whip, we have the vice chairman of the committee. I've talked to Senator Schumer, Senator McConnell. Everybody says that we're going to have an appropriations process this year. We're pledging to do it. We may have to train senators as to how to do that, because it requires agreeing to allow Durbin to bring his amendment up and not block the Alexander Amendment and that sort of thing. So we've done one step, which is a 2-year budget agreement. But we still could be faced with continuing resolutions. And I wonder if you'd want to use this occasion to remind the committee, so we can remind our colleagues of how damaging a continuing resolution would be this year if we didn't do the defense appropriation bill on time for the entire year.
Senator, as you know, we, over many years of combat and of reduced funding and continuing resolutions, 9 of the last 10 years, we got ourselves into a position where we are losing or eroding our competitive edge. We still have the edge in land combat, in maritime combat, in air combat, and elsewhere. But we are losing that edge, and it's largely due to the uncertainty and the budget unpredictability and the inability to reprogram large amounts of money to a dynamic security situation. We are not going to get out of the hole we're in a matter of a year or 18 months or 2 years. So we're going to have to get back to regular order with predictability so that we're spending the money wisely. We're not spending it on things we don't need, but prohibited from new starts of things that we do need. The research and engineering is underway. If we actually produce what looks like is going to work for us, the last thing we want to do is say, but we can't make the change right now because we're back under a continuing resolution. So this would be financially a disaster. It would reduce my ability to ensure that I spent all the money wisely, which is my obligation to you who fund us. So to me, this would be putting us right back where we were in the hole before, and it was exactly what you had to dig us out of with this bill this time around. So I think we need to get back to regular order, And I think that the continuing resolution also puts the Congress into a spectator seat. They're watching what's happening. From our point of view, we want Congress in the driver's seat on the budget, and if I can't convince you to fund something, then we shouldn't get it. But our intent is to make certain that if we satisfy you, you tell us that you'll give us the money. Under the CR, of course, that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Durbin for holding this hearing. Of course, I appreciate it when Secretary Mattis and General Dunford and those with them are here. I might just say personally, I appreciate the fact that the Secretary and the General, every time I had a question for them or reached out for on a response, they've been there and they've responded. And that makes it a lot easier. Now, Senator Durbin had talked about the budget for our national defense accounts. It's more than half of our nation's discretionary spending. It's larger than any other country by far. And I said when the subcommittee, and I voted for it, I said when the subcommittee met with you last year, I'm grateful you understand the importance of both adequately funding our troops, our national defense programs, and the domestic and foreign assistance programs that support families, improve educational opportunities, promote diplomacy and democracy abroad, and fulfill our promise to our veterans. Now, Secretary Mattis, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which we passed by bipartisan majorities in the Senate and the House, signed into law by the President, included $654 billion for defense, plus another $11 billion for military construction. It's a massive increase over what even the President had requested. You talked about rebuilding and improving readiness, and I could not agree more about that. But I think, and again to follow up on what Senator Durbin has said, I want to ensure that the funding is not only spent, but spent responsibly in these remaining 6 years. You're going to have that audit that you've talked about in November, Mr. Secretary. I think you've answered this, but I want to make absolutely sure. It's easy to tell us the good news. Will you commit to tell us the bad news, if there is bad news in that audit?
Senator Leahy, I think we have an obligation to be even more forthcoming with the bad news because you expect the good news. You expect us to do it right. And we're going to have to bring the bad news when the audit uncovers things, when our criminal investigators uncover things. We're going to have to bring that to you and not even wait on your questions. That's my direction to the department, to the service secretaries, the comptroller, chief financial officer. But we are going to be forthcoming with it to the point that you can trust us that we're not sweeping something under the rug. We will not enjoy it, I'm sure, but that's our obligation.
Well, and I think Mr. Norquist is very much in tune with that, and I know General Dunford is. The President's ordered additional National Guard personnel to the southwest border for security. He's raised the possibility of using Defense Department funds to pay for his border wall. Has he instructed you to use Defense Department funds to construct a wall on the southern border?
No, sir, he is not.
And we didn't provide defense dollars in the omnibus to build this wall.
Senator Lee, if I could correct myself here, there is a portion of a bombing range that is immediately adjacent to the border. And for years, we've tried to maintain the fencing or walling off of that so that no migrant, illegal or whatever, can get into an impact range. But so for that one area, Barry Goldwater range and down along the
I know
border,
the range.
we do protect that range so that no one is inadvertently killed or wounded.
That's a different thing. That's
Yes,
a
sir.
military installation.
That's the only place.
You have a cost estimates of $18 to $20 billion. If you were asked to build the wall, there's a lot of things you'd have to cut out. Is that correct?
I don't have the authority to provide that money, sir.
Good. Now, General Engel last month testified the National Guard would not have any direct contact with migrants unless they were explicitly authorized by the Department of Defense. I'm reluctant to see the National Guard in a law enforcement role. Are you planning to change the Guard's traditional role of supplanting or of supporting civil authorities into a law enforcement role?
Sir, right now, we are not having any contact with migrants. I'm in constant contact with Secretary Nielsen, and she has not asked for that support, and I have no plans to provide that support for any contact between the National Guard and migrants.
I have watched with pride a lot of our National Guard units around the country, but they're not law enforcement units, and they're not trained for that, and should not be. And General Dunford, you've heard me brag a lot about the Vermont's National Guard's source of pride for the Green Mountain State. It's soon going to be the base for the Air Force's F-35A. The Air Force was in charge of the basing selection. But can you explain the overall strategic value to national defense of basing this new jet in the Northeast, especially as that's an area seeing a decline in basing in the past few years?
Senator, that Platform 1 will be useful both when we make forward deployments as well as for Homeland Security. Incredible fifth-generation fighter, low observable, and a very significant improvement in our ability to share knowledge on a battlefield. So the F-35 is very significant. With regard to its importance in the Northeast, it'll contribute, the F-35 and the Guard will contribute to Homeland Security by flying what we call combat air patrols over the United States to preclude a threat in any kind of circumstance. So it is very important.
And would you provide us, for the record, a summary of the value of the Army and Marine Corps mountain warfare training that we've been doing at the Army Mountain Warfare School in Vermont, the value that has to the joint force?
Senator, I'll do that. I've personally trained there 2 or 3 times and be happy to provide that for the record.
Obviously, it may sound somewhat parochial, but I'm awfully proud of the men and women who train there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service and for appearing before the committee today. Secretary Mattis, you have appropriately noted that Russia, as well as China, but Russia is a strategic competitor, is the word that you use, seeking to create a world consistent with their authoritarian models and pursue veto power over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. I think we see that very, very, very clearly up in the Arctic region. In the past 10 years, we have seen the Russians move dramatically, and actually in the past year, even more so. And yet, our U.S. Arctic strategy has yet to evolve to this changing dynamic. And the concern that I have is that rather than the Arctic being this place for commerce, a stable area with freedom of maneuver, that Russia is positioning themselves to control the Arctic, control its resources, control the sea lanes. And if the Northern Sea Route becomes a major shipping lane, Russia is poised to be that sole power that could effectively sanction or threaten to coerce, project power. We have had many conversations about this. Last May, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, spoke about the Arctic not being a central concern in the 2014 National Defense Strategy. Now we've got the newly published 2018 strategy summary, and it also does not specifically highlight the Arctic region nor address how long-standing gaps in Arctic infrastructure will be addressed. So I'm getting to this place. We have discussions about it. I raised the issue of the Arctic and what we're seeing up north, and again, this very dynamic area. But I am reluctantly coming to the impression that the Department of Defense does not have a coherent vision for addressing America's defense interests in the changing Arctic at this point in time. And that the view is that it's going to be a problem someday, but that right now it's not a problem, and so we don't need to address it. So I'd like to know if you think I'm wrong in that impression, and if you can share with me what you believe the vision is and how we intend to resource it, because things are changing quickly in a dramatic way up there.
Well, I appreciate the strategic nature of your question, Senator. The first point I would make is, yes, there is a prioritization that goes on as we look at the strategy. What are the near and present threats, this sort of thing. But I would also point out that the entire strategy is drawn with a by, with, and through approach. And why do I bring that up? The Arctic Council, as you no doubt are aware, Denmark, Norway, Canada, the United States, and Russia. And there are other observer nations. China is one, by the way, that's helping to fund Russia and their activities in the north. But my point is that you can see that 4 of those 5 nations are democracies. So as we look at our line of effort number 2 about strengthening alliances and partnerships, and again, the United States, Canada, Norway, Denmark, all NATO allies, you can see that our approach is heavily involved with those allies when you look at the Arctic Council makeup. So the more that we work by, with, and through allies, including several, Denmark and Norway, that keep a very close eye on the North, we are in effect working in a coalition of sorts right now. Now, it's not a military coalition.
And that was what I was going to interject, was that the Arctic Council specifically says that defense and defense strategies are not part of what they deal with.
That's correct. But at the same time, Russia has to confront the claims of, for example, Denmark and Norway, where they contradict Russian claims. So I think there's still an advantage in the diplomatic realm of this competition that Russia's chosen. But at the same time, you will see new icebreakers coming into the Coast Guard inventory. Those are being funded.
We have 1 funded, but we need to have a plan for the additional 5, and I'd like to work with you all on that.
I couldn't agree more. I agree 100% with you. Senator, again, there's an effort to make certain that what we're doing is with others so that we're not carrying the full financial or military costs. But it is an area of increased concern because as the ice sheet melts backward, we've got waterways open that we didn't have to confront year-round in the past. So I think right now I have your concern loud and clear. I think we're doing the right thing, but I cannot articulate either that full strategy you're looking for, and we are putting it together with other parts of the government. Anything else, Chairman?
Senator, the only thing I'd add is, speaking at it from a military perspective, you know, in the 1990s, we actually developed regional strategies, so they'd be focused on the Arctic, the Pacific, or the Atlantic. The global campaign plans that we've developed right now, which are classified, take a problem set approach. So we have a global campaign plan for Russia, which accounts for the military capabilities that they have postured in the Arctic. And so our plans no longer are focused specifically geographically. For example, in the 1990s, we might have had a plan specifically focused on defending the Baltics. We now take a much broader approach to the full range of challenges that Russia provides. And so I would argue, at least at the military level, the Arctic is fully included in our global campaign plan for Russia, specifically the military capabilities that they have postured in the Arctic and the threat that they pose.
Well, know that you will find me aggressively pushing on this to make sure that we do have that broader view. Let me ask one additional short question, and I'll submit the rest for the record. This will be to you, General Dunford, and this is regarding how we have integrated women in combat. That formal process began in January of 13. We've seen the integration of women into the front lines. equipment requirements for women are lagging. Currently, only the Army has women-specific body armor, but quantities are so low that I understand it's only issued to women who are deploying and not during any initial entry or unit training. I had a conversation just yesterday with some of our women veterans, and this was an issue that they had raised to my attention. Can you tell me what actions are being taken to ensure that women are properly equipped for the combat roles?
I can, Senator, and to be honest, in 2016, when I submitted my recommendation for integration, one of the areas that I identified was what we call tariff sizes. So we knew in 2016 that the standard equipment, particularly as women began to occupy fields where they hadn't historically been, and they were wearing combat armor, packs, those kinds of things,
Rucksacks, yeah,
had been built for the average male and not the average female, and that we would have to adjust that. And we knew it would take some time. And so I know that each of the services now has an initiative to change the tariff sizes to accommodate the different body types of women, but it is taking some time. But I can assure you they are all attentive to it and in fielding equipment. And although you said only the Army has done it, I'm fairly certain, and I'll get back to you personally, I'm fairly certain that the other services have also been informed by integration of women into occupational fields where they hadn't historically served, and the needs to adjust equipment accordingly.
well, certainly would hope that we would have it during training as well as deployment. So thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Secretary Mattis, the unclassified summary of the 2018 National Defense Strategy noted that the department's principal priorities over the long term are managing strategic competition with China and Russia. Can you walk us through how vital Hawaii and the forces in the state are to DoD's long-term efforts to countering China and Russia and to our defense posture in the Pacific specifically?
You know, Senator, it's probably the key outpost anywhere west of the West Coast. It is the fundamental anchor point for the fleet. It is the significant command and control effort. I mean, we obviously have redundancies built in elsewhere, but this is our, I would just call it the home port for all things in the Pacific, and augmented, of course, by the other locations from the West Coast to Alaska, Guam.
Thank you. And I'd like you to take us on a tour of the Pacific AOR, excluding the countries and the alliances and the adversaries that we normally have. I'm particularly interested in our emerging relationship with India and the status of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the Philippines.
Right. If we start, let's start as far west with India. India, the world's most populous democracy, they've been very open, inviting for a stronger mill-to-mill relationship. They see it in their best interest. These two democracies have every reason to work together because we want the same thing, basically. We don't have to search for common ground. We have common ground on respect for international law, territorial integrity, sovereignty, freedom of navigation. All these efforts are aligned. When we walk in, we can just go through our talking points and check them off. Okay, we all agree. Now let's work about what we're going to do about it. As you work further to the east, what you have is Australia, anchor point in the South Pacific, a steadfast ally through good times and bad, goes back 100 years. 100 years of mateship is what they call it. We're celebrating that this year. And further, they have been, I would just say, they have launched many initiatives to maintain stability in the Southern Pacific with the island nations there that need a hand. New Zealand, as you know, one of the Five Eyes. Moving further up, we have got with Indonesia, which is a fulcrum between the Indian and Pacific Ocean, fulcrum in the Indo-Pac area. We see a country that is trying to carve its own way forward, and that means to break out of its reliance on past purchases, for example, of Russian weapons, that sort of thing. Clearly, when you go over to Singapore, which has gone out of its way to help us in terms of home porting U.S. Navy units, support to our folks out there, and they also, as you know, train in Idaho. And I can keep going like this. In the Philippines, we're maintaining a long-term view to maintain that relationship, and it goes right up to Japan and the strength they provide in the Northern Pacific and our.
And I'll ask one question for the record about the Compact of Free Association, the Palau Compact of Free Association kind of languishing, and the one for the Marshals and FSM expiring in 2023. And I'd like for the committee's understanding and for the whole Senate's understanding to reinforce how essential that is for our defense strategy. I'd like to change topics to the DoD's post Don't Ask, Don't Tell discharge review policy. I just want to confirm that the DoD policy established in 2011 to review discharges due to sexual orientation is the same.
I'm not aware of any change. I don't.
It's not a trick question. Yeah.
One.
Yeah. So since 1970, roughly 43,000 service members were discharged due to sexual orientation. These are those who were discharged solely for what they called homosexual behavior, not any combination of so-called offenses. But so far, only around 1,000 applications have been reviewed. I get that some of this may be a resource question, but more people need to know that this review is available to them, and it's highly technical, so it's not good enough to have good policy. You have to allow people to seek the kind of justice that they deserve, and not everybody knows how to do it. And so will you work with me and others interested in the Senate to make sure that individuals separated under Don't Ask, Don't Tell or similar policy know that they have a way for their records to be reviewed, potentially upgraded and removed of any derogatory comments?
I will, Senator. First, I need to determine the problem. You know, what is the holdup here before I tell you exactly what I'm going to do. But I have no problem working with you at all, sir. Absolutely.
Sure. And one of the problems is that before 1970, individuals were separated sometimes under ambiguous codes. They were euphemisms to sort of allow the service member to save face. So they were discharged for what would have otherwise, post-1970, be considered homosexual behavior, but they, for instance, convenience to the government, unsuitability. These are really tough ones to get to because you don't necessarily know what unsuitability means or convenience to the government. But this conceals the real reason for discharge in some instances, and it's extremely difficult for these individuals who have no other aggravating circumstances to have their records reviewed. So can we work together on especially the pre-1970 issue, but more generally making sure that the mechanics of this review process are clear and robust, and that former service members who were discharged under either Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or or what came before it, know that this is available to them. This is not an easy one, but this is a commitment we've all made in the Congress, and the department has made it, and now we've got to execute.
No reservations on it, sir. I need to just make sure I don't run afoul of privacy concerns, frankly, by people who may not want to make that appeal. But we're certainly willing to look at it. I mean, the law is the law, and no reservations on that. But we have to find our way through that. That's why I mean you need to look at what the real problem is, and if they're shy about bringing it forward, I'm not sure how we would legally do it, and I'm not even real sure how we would do the review ourselves internally if it was done in a way to look out for at that time the dignity that the person requested. So let me look at it, Senator, and we'll work with you on it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. Secretary Mattis, in your prepared remarks, you said the modernization of our nuclear triad is the department, quote, the department's top priority, end quote, which I completely agree with, and would note you're able to fund this top priority for about 4% of your total requests in FY19. Yet there's still critics that complain about the cost. So would you agree that spending 4% of the defense budget for nuclear modernization is both cost-effective and affordable? Can you also address how our nuclear deterrent helps form the foundation for the rest of our defense? And then one more piece, Also, how is it important for our allies in Europe and East Asia, particularly in terms of them being confident that our nuclear forces are credible and effective?
Right. Senator, first, the nuclear deterrent is the basis. They must deter the use of those weapons. We don't ever want to see them used. I believe that the cost of 4% is absolutely affordable. Secondly, even though it grows in the out years, there is a rise. Just to be fully candid here, because we've delayed this over some time. It was started by the last administration, the modernization program. It will rise up into the 6.3% at its height. But I believe it is absolutely affordable as the basis for the defense of the country. Our allies, sir, I took the nuclear posture review in its draft forms, early forms, to Brussels. I briefed our allies, our NATO allies, who are critical. I've discussed this issue with the Republic of Korea and Japan, for example, and it has been welcomed by them. I was surprised when I actually rolled it out and went to Brussels in its final form, but I think because we had included them, they were 100% aligned with us, that this was the deterrent that was necessary. I've been asked both in Seoul and Tokyo, does that nuclear umbrella protect them? And we've assured them it does. What we're doing, in effect, is a non-proliferation effort because they trust us. Right. We don't see more nuclear-armed countries in the world, and that is critical if we're to try to keep on a track towards reducing these weapons overall.
I think that's an incredibly important point, that last point. Senator Murkowski brought up the Arctic region. My question in regard to the Arctic region, do we have sufficient intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities in the Arctic to ensure that we know what's going on in the Arctic? And I would ask for General Dunford to follow up as well. Are we making adequate use of unmanned assets like Global Hawk to do that?
Senator, let me let General Dunford get into some of the military aspects there. I would just tell you, sir, we've had to make priorities on these scarce assets, what we call high-demand assets, and we engaged in the active operations we have going on in certain areas. We have prioritized that where we have troops in harm's way. So I don't believe we're doing everything we could be doing or even should be if we had unlimited assets in the Arctic. But right now, I think we're making the prudent steps to grow our ISR forces that will allow us in the future to do a better job. But, General.
Senator, I know you're aware that for many years we took our eye off the ball with regard to Russia, and about 2 years ago, it isn't just the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms we have fielded every day, but it's the analytic effort as well to look at Russia. Mm-hmm. And 2 years ago, we significantly increased our analytic effort towards Russia and really dedicated a large portion of our Defense Intelligence Agency now to look specifically at Russia. Just to put it in perspective, we're meeting overall somewhere between 30 and 40% of each of the combatant commanders' demands. So if you would talk to General Scaparrotti and you would ask the question you just asked, he would say, no, I don't have adequate resources to keep an eye on Russia. And as the Secretary said, that's as a result of us balancing the global demand, which we have significantly shifted towards North Korea of late. And then with regard to unmanned resources, we are absolutely leveraging unmanned resources and keeping our eye on Russia and specifically the Arctic.
Well, in a broader context, that relates, again, both to the pilot shortage, and I would ask, again, starting with the Secretary, do you see the pilot shortage as a critical issue? How are we addressing that? And then the other aspect is counter-UAS, counter-drone. For example, in my state in Grand Forks, North Dakota, we have 900 miles of border responsibility. We have a military installation, Grand Forks, combined with a technology park, combined with Customs and Border Protection, combined with our Guard that's all working with aviation assets like UAS to try to cover this border. So both, again, pilot shortage, which is getting more acute, and then this counter-drone impact. What are you doing there, and how are we getting on top of those issues?
Senator, I'll touch the pilot shortage, and I know the Secretary has given us all some very specific counter-UAS directions, so I'll let him speak to that. I think you know we do have a significant pilot shortage across all the services, 2,000 short in the Air Force alone. Mm-hmm. This obviously has the attention of all the service chiefs. General Goldfein, Admiral Richardson, General Neller in particular have all done some detailed research to figure out what will take to incentivize people to stay and to recruit more pilots. This budget does address in part the shortage of pilots, to increase numbers of pilots and throughput. And part of it has been throughput, the numbers of people that we can train at a single time. So we're increasing that. And General Goldfein's also met with industry to include commercial pilots, because as you know, the shortfall is not just in the U.S. military, it's in commercial aviation as well.
Manned and unmanned. I mean,
Manned and unmanned.
in almost every aspect of what we fly.
And maintainers as well, Senator.
Right.
Yes, sir, we're working the issue hard, sir. We're working in each of the services, but we also have a departmental overview of this to make certain that we're not solving one problem and creating another. On the counter UAS, this has become an increasing problem. We now track every overflight of our bases, ships, airfields, and I was surprised to see just how much of this is being dealt with. We are probably going to have to come in to the FAA and perhaps even to Congress and ask for additional authorities.
That's what I thought.
We have the authority, as you know, over certain sensitive sites. You know some of them well, but we do not have the authority to take these down over many other sites, the normal military base. The problem is it's only a matter of time before the threat manifests in a violent way. So we're going to have to come in with a very clear statement of what we need from the Congress or the FAA, and then get that authority out, get the systems out to take them down, and make certain we're not running afoul of any. And we got to be careful, again, that some of the things that we would take a UAV down with, we don't want to take down a passenger jet, for example.
Right.
There's a reason it's got to be integrated. We're working this, and we're tracking every incursion now, every single one, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Senator Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service. Secretary Mattis, I wanted to ask you, because I was deeply disturbed by a March 2018 Associated Press investigation that revealed a massive failure of DOD officials to protect children who are sexually assaulted on our military bases. The AP documented nearly 600 sexual assault cases that have occurred on bases since 2007, including actually more than 30 reports in my home state of Washington. And just recently, the Army released information on 86 additional cases. Even more shocking, it appears that these children and their families have no recourse. So almost 2 months ago, I wrote to you about this issue, asking for some straightforward questions about the scope of the problem and the department's response. The DOD education activity had an initial conversation with my staff, but I am still waiting for answers to those questions and many that I have. So I'm concerned that the department is not taking this seriously, and wanted to ask you if you can tell me today with certainty how many juveniles have experienced sexual violence or harassment on a military base in the last 10 years.
Senator, first of all, you'll have an answer within the week. I was unaware of that, but thank you for bringing it up. You know, Senator, I accept that we're going to have casualties on battlefields. It's part of the military's role. We're not a life insurance corporation. Our young troops sign up and they sign a blank check to carry out their mission on a battlefield. I do not accept a single casualty in the Department of Defense out of sexual assault. That is intolerable. That, to me, is something that must be rooted out. It's important we stand up and say what we stand for. On this one, it's even more important we say what we will not tolerate. So I don't know how different this is from the civilian society, so I don't know if it's a unique problem to us, but obviously we've got to look at it and see if it's because of what we're bringing into our ranks and how do we stop it, is the bottom line. More importantly, do we have the federal authority?
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Who has legal jurisdiction over military children on the military installations, both here and abroad?
Let me get back to you specifically, because I think it's also different depending on where it's located, and I may have to break this out. But we will get back to you with a full answer. Is all of it in your letter, what you need to know?
Yes, and we'll make sure, if you can get us the answers back to that, and what specific steps the Army and others are
Let me get back to you, Senator. 7 days from now, you'll have an answer.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Let me go back to the Iran deal. As you know, President Trump announced he's going to begin steps to pull us out. That deal wasn't perfect, and Iran's other aggression in the region has to be addressed. But based on everything I've heard, according to the IAEA and our Intelligence Committee, the deal was holding, Iran was meeting its commitments, and I haven't seen any evidence from President Trump to the contrary. So I'm concerned that this is going to be a destabilizing move that, in addition, undermines our credibility. And I'm concerned it dramatically raises the risk of a military confrontation. Now, in his remarks yesterday, the President made several veiled threats towards Iran, and I wanted to ask you, has the Department been asked to develop military options against Iran?
Ma'am, Senator, we maintain military options because of Iran's bellicose statements and threats, death to America. We have maintained those. As you know, I had some experience in Central Command in my past life, and those plans remain operant.
Okay, so I understood from his statement yesterday that he was going to ask you to develop plans. You just have plans in place? Nothing new is going to be developed as a result of this?
Senator, we are always updating those plans. It's a constant. I don't want to tell you it's frozen in time. The plans are updated as rapidly as needed, and if not, if a need is not seen, they're actually on a required update, so that they can't languish.
Well, okay, I would just ask that you regularly update this committee on any new plans that you are developing in response to this. Okay. Let me ask a different question. The Department's nuclear posture review calls for developing 2 new capabilities for delivering low-yield nuclear weapons. The Department claims these systems will make the use of nuclear weapons less likely, but that can only be true if we are more willing to use those weapons. The administration has yet to convince me why this is a good use of our defense dollars, instead of investing in critically needed conventional systems or training our personnel. Why is the combination of our current nuclear deterrent and significant conventional weapons capabilities insufficient?
Yeah, Senator, what we have found as we listened to the President of Russia is an increased willingness out of Moscow to discuss the use of nuclear weapons, specifically escalate to de-escalate, which means they're in a conventional fight, it's not going well, so they escalate. The de-escalation is based on their success. What we need to do is make it very clear you cannot escalate to a low-yield nuclear weapon and confront us. We only have 2 choices. Use high-yield weapons, which means we would now be escalating the fight, or do nothing, which would mean surrender. Basically, from our perspective, we would characterize it as suicide or surrender. So by having the low yield, we are attempting to checkmate their thinking that they could employ, deter them from employing even a low yield nuclear weapon. It is the adaptation of the nuclear deterrent to the dynamic threat, the changing threat, so it's not frozen in a Cold War mentality where we were willing to go high yield immediately against a high yield attack. Once they start talking about low yield as a way to escalate a conventional fight, we need to adapt our deterrent.
Okay, and I'm out of time, but I did want to bring to your attention the issue of spouse employment for our military. I've talked to a number of spouses recently who can't get a job around their base where they live. I've actually heard from military spouses in our home state who face this challenge and actually told me that they hide their military affiliation. These are the spouses because employers don't call them back if they know that they're going to leave again or don't have long-term commitments. So this is a huge question, and I'd love to, I wanted to bring it to your attention, but love to talk to you more about it at some other time about how we can make sure that we remove the obstacles, because this is a challenge for recruitment, it's a challenge for retention, it's a challenge for these families economically, and I really believe we need to take some steps to address it.
Got it.
Senator Moran.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Secretary Mattis, let me begin a discussion of cyber space. You requested $8.6 billion in FY19 to build cyber capabilities and perform missions to defend the department networks, weapon systems, and information. I think when we think of cybersecurity, we often think of our defensive capabilities as part of the 133 cyber mission force teams you're developing. I want to draw your attention to cyber teams that specialize in threat analysis or emulation. I'm referring to the work of the NSA-certified cyber red teams, which are the only cyber red teams authorized to operate DoD networks and capable of simulating cyber attacks on DoD systems or major weapon systems. They're there to determine if there are vulnerabilities that compromise our system or our weapons that are being tested. The 2006 Defense Authorization Act mandated that cyber red team testing on each major weapon system and to develop strategies to mitigate the risks of cyber vulnerabilities identified in those evaluations. That's referred to as adversarial assessments, and they're primarily managed by the Director of Operation Tests and Evaluations, DOT&E. Mr. Secretary, there's only a handful of NSA-certified red teams authorized to conduct those assessments, and I'm concerned that DoD is not addressing what DOT&E has described as a chronic red team shortfall to meet the demands of cyber threat testing. Cyber funding has increased roughly 36% since 2016, and that lends me to these kinds of questions. Will the department allocate cyber funds toward increasing NSA-certified red teams? Are any of the 133 total cyber mission force teams are developing, are there planned to be NSA-certified red teams that can conduct those adversarial assessments? The point here is that I want to understand how the department is approaching cyber red teams, and when we do the assessments, then what's the result of those assessments in ending or reducing the vulnerabilities that those red teams have determined exist. Maybe the shortcut of that is that I'm worried that we're underemphasizing the value of those red teams in assessing the challenge and determining the vulnerabilities. So we need more red teams. And then secondly, once the red team determines the vulnerability, what is the department's reaction and response to end those vulnerabilities?
As you know, Senator, right now we're in the midst of coming up with our cyber posture review. You've heard talk earlier about the nuclear posture review. We're doing a similar effort with a cyber posture review. I'm a strong believer in red teams. I use CIA's red team all the time on policies, on what if, this sort of thing, on everything we do. As far as what we have to do, I think about $3.4 billion is going into test, evaluation. That's part of the budget of the cyber effort. And in there will be cyber red team, not just creating a robust capability, but also how do we follow up and track it to make certain we've corrected the deficiency. But it has been a problem. I will tell you, I found a number of IG reports, some of which, not many, but some of which dealt with cyber vulnerabilities. And the number of them that had not been, and this goes back 10 years, that had not been corrected, the vulnerabilities shown, struck me. So this is an effort by Deputy Secretary Shanahan right now. It's at such a priority that we've raised it up to my number 2 because it cuts across all the services. It cuts across all parts of DoD, from nuclear to conventional. So this is an area where after I get done with the cyber posture review, which I expect we've got our new Lieutenant General just promoted to General, took over, General Nakasone out at Cyber Command, and I expect to have this within months right now. But we will work this forward. You don't have to sell me on red team, sir. I'm a believer, and we will find a way to get them built up to whatever level is needed. Better we find our problems than the enemy finds them.
I appreciate your response. Perhaps the Deputy Secretary would be willing to have a conversation with us about this topic.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that, and it seems to me that it's important that we not miss this opportunity, and that red teams have, as you indicated, great value. And I wanted to make sure that that you had an awareness of this, and the department was taking this this aspect of cybersecurity seriously. While I started my questions by talking about cybersecurity, I'll say this. I'll say it in passing, and I don't know that there's a question here. But I also have concern that in the focus on cybersecurity, the focus on Russia, the focus on China, we need to make certain we don't forget the men and women who are serving in Afghanistan. I know that you responded to a question from Senator Durbin in regard to Afghanistan, but I would not want to not take this opportunity to highlight. I visited Afghanistan a few months back with then Acting Secretary of the Army Ryan McCarthy. I saw things that were impressive to me, but we have so many challenges in the world that I don't want us to forget the young men and women and their circumstances in Afghanistan. I know I don't have to tell you or General Dunford these things, but I want to make certain that I don't miss the opportunity of highlighting in this setting the value of our continued support for our military men and women.
And grateful you brought them up. They're never out of our minds, sir, but thank you.
I have no doubt about that, sir. I don't know that I can ask this question in 31 seconds. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to question the Secretary and the Chief, and I will submit a couple of questions in writing.
Okay. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo the comments of so many people on this panel, in fact, everybody on this panel, an appreciation for you, Secretary Mattis, and you, General Dunford, and the work that you do. I can't thank you enough, and the people that serve under you. Thank you. It's a complicated world, and I don't need to tell you that. And Afghanistan is incredibly complicated. This goes off of what Durbin mentioned earlier, and that Moran had referenced. A year ago, we had about 8,400 troops in Afghanistan. Last fall, the last report we got, there was about 15,000. The Wall Street Journal, and correct me if they're wrong, because they could be, but they're reporting that the number of Afghan Army and police personnel decreased by about 36,000 people last year. It looks to me that our presence is going up while their presence, the people within the country, which I think is critically important, is going down. You've requested about $5.2 billion for Afghan security forces in this budget. Number one, we've put about $78 billion into it already. Are we making headway? Look, I mean, I'm not indicating that I think that this isn't a valiant effort. It is, but Afghanistan's been around, and we've seen a lot of turmoil for decades and decades and decades around that country. Can you give me any sort of assurance that there's an end?
Senator Tester, since the Russian invasion in 1979, that society has been turned upside down. And since 2001, we've been there. I think the most difficult point to convey today, and we just heard from a senator who just visited there in the last few months, progress and violence coexist in Afghanistan. The Taliban are turning to blowing up the registration stations, and they're doing that because they recognize they can't win at the ballot box, so they're trying to win with bombs. They've turned away from attacking many of the Afghan forces because we're now mentoring more. And in that regard, I would just point out that we are going with more attention to the quality of those Afghan forces. So in some cases, what we've done is, due to better accounting, we've made certain there's no ghost soldiers. In other words, we're paying for a soldier who's not really there. There's a stricter accountability for who's getting paid to make certain they exist. And we're going to expand the size of the elite forces, and there will be a reduction overall in the number of forces, because we know the mentored by the NATO forces, supported by NATO, those forces always win against the enemy. The ones that were not are some of those that have been reduced in size.
So the reporting that the Wall Street Journal talked about, you believe is more of an accounting issue than it is a real body issue?
It may be real bodies in the sense, Senator, that where we, for example, if a Kandak, a battalion of regular Army, is not going to be mentored, and we're building up a commando battalion, a commando Kandak, that may be a smaller Kandak, but it's going to be more effective. So it's more a quality, not quantity on that. Chairman, can you give any background on this?
I can, Senator. Part of it is also casualties of the Afghans. And if I could just address the idea that we've been doing the same thing over and again for 17 years and just maybe put in context our current strategy relative to what we've been doing. In my judgment, from 2001 to 2013, we did the fighting in Afghanistan, and we somewhat pejoratively talked about an Afghan face on coalition capability from 2001 to 2013. In June of 2013, we actually said to the Afghans, okay, you have now responsibility for your country. And when we said that, we had over 100,000 coalition forces in Afghanistan. From 2013 to 2017, we drew down to the 8,000 plus that you spoke about. I think there's really three phases in Afghanistan. There's the phase where we fought. There's the phase where we drew down. That was our primary mission between 2013 and 2017. You can't come from a high of 140,000 down to 8,000 without singularly focusing on logistics and the challenges associated with the drawdown. I really do believe that this year, in conjunction with the South Asia strategy, this is the first time we are providing the Afghans with the capabilities they need and the advisory effort they need to actually fight the counterinsurgency themselves. Are there challenges? Absolutely. And I think that with the numbers question you asked specifically, Senator, what we expect to see, one of the things we expect to see because of the strategy we've implemented is a reduction in Afghan casualties and a commensurate increase in the numbers of Afghans that might be willing to serve. It is a volunteer service.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk, approach this a little different way than what Senator Murray did on the JCPOA. When you drafted this budget, Secretary Mattis, did you have in mind that the President may be pulling out of the JCPOA? And the reason I ask that is that are there any budgetary impacts with the pullout of the JCPOA? In other words, are you anticipating you're going to have to invest more dollars militarily than you are now because of that withdrawal of the JCPOA?
I do not anticipate asking for more dollars. Now, should Iran do something?
Yeah, it's a different story.
That's a different issue. But no, I'm not coming to you with an additional supplemental funding request.
So you're confident that the budget will reflect the realities even with our removal from the JCPOA?
I am confident, Senator.
Thank you. Just want to talk about mental health for a second. I only got 45 seconds. You guys know all the figures. But we've got a problem in our active components. We have a worse problem in our reserves and our National Guard. Can you tell me within this budget if there is any prioritization of resources to deal with the Guard and Reserve components' ability to address the suicide problem, epidemic, whatever you want to call it?
I'm going to have to get back to you. David, do you know this one?
I do not.
No, we're going to have to take that one for the record, Senator. We'll get you an answer very quickly.
And once again, thank you, gentlemen, for the job you do. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me start by thanking you for three specific things that particularly General Dunford and Secretary Mattis you've worked on. One is supporting the National Geospatial transfer from St. Louis, from the facility they've been in for 70 years to a new facility. Also, I think this is the first time I recall that the Super Hornets, which this committee's always been very supportive of, made the regular budget as opposed to the the budget you'd like to have and always in the Super Hornet category got, but a multi-year procurement request there helps keep that line open. And then we've all talked about this before, but your willingness to both work for and now implement the Military Family Stability Act that was in the Defense Authorization Act that time, that would not have happened if both of you hadn't understood the importance of it happening, and we want to continue to work on those things. B-21 basing decision, looking first at current bases is the logical way to do this and the way you have approached it, but to the degree you can discuss it, the B-21 issues, whatever you can discuss here, can you elaborate on the efficiencies and savings generated by using existing bases, and then your view of what kind of commitment we're going to need to make moving forward to facilities to deal with the addition of the B-21 to the force?
Senator, every new type model aircraft brings with it a certain logistical requirement, so we'll have to address the maturation of the basing locations. And while we would always be looking at existing bases and of course, dispersal points for them, we also have to look at the changing world situation and make certain those existing bases where we have strategic aircraft now are the right locations for them in the future, and any modification to those bases. So I don't want to say absolutely they're going to the same base. I can't tell you that right now. Clearly, they would have a leg up unless there's a strategic reason to shift them elsewhere.
Well, and I think what we'll need to look at there too, and as soon as we do have a sense of where they're going to go, is what the military construction needs might be, what we ought to be thinking about as we think about adding that to our future defense posture. I want to talk a little bit about Korea. I was on some news program the other day and asked, in Korea, what would you see as the line that would be non-negotiable? Now, my view, which if anybody could persuade me that my view was wrong, the two of you at the table might be able to do that, but my view was that for the foreseeable future, our presence in Korea, not a negotiable issue. The South Koreans have really stepped up with the money they've invested in the new basing for us, as well as the other assistance that we get from them to be there. I know this is an ongoing discussion. I know, General Mattis, you have discussed it recently. What do you see as the importance of our presence, not only in the Korean Peninsula, but also our regional presence and the advantages we would have with the new base there and the South Korean support that we get for our regional presence there, and what kind of negotiating item that may or may not be?
Senator, Korea, the red line I would say is the verifiable, irreversible, nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. This is the policy of the United States, of South Korea, of Japan, China, Russia. It's the same policy for all. I think it's why you've seen 3 unanimous UN Security Council resolutions in the last little over a year imposing sanctions on Korea, on DPRK, North Korea. And I think that stands as the goal of the negotiation that we're entering into, that's underway actually right now with Secretary Pompeo having just left there, having done more of the preparation work. The presence of our forces there, and as you're aware, sir, that 90% of the cost of that new base is borne by Republic of Korea. The presence of our forces there is a stabilizing presence. If we had no one there and we moved in that many troops, that could actually have a destabilizing effect. In other words, the fact that they're there, everything's stable, the Americans are committed, and this I would just say resonates among allies, and not just in Japan and Korea, because those forces are in the Northwest Pacific, but also around the world when they see that when trouble looms, we don't walk away. Now, if during the negotiation this issue was to come up between our allies and us, that would be one thing between 2 allies, not a matter of the negotiation with DPRK, for example. That is a sovereign decision of the people and the government of the ROK and the people and the government of the United States. That's not something that would be on the table in the initial negotiation.
And the move to the new base, when do you anticipate that will happen, and when would it be completed, General Dunford? Is it?
Senator, I was there probably 3 or 4 months ago, and it's actually ongoing.
Right. And when do you think that move will be completed?
I'll get back to you to confirm it, but my understanding was it'll be complete in this calendar year.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Shelby, and thank you all for your service, and we're really lucky, I think, to have you. I agree with Senator Durbin's earlier comments on Iran and withdrawing from the Iran agreement. This is a big mistake. It splits us from our allies and puts us on a path to war with Iran. And, Mr. Secretary, I really appreciate your advocacy and outspokenness on this issue. We understand the President has made his decision and is going to withdraw and reimpose sanctions. If Iran were to restart its nuclear weapons program, do you believe the President can order a unilateral attack to stop that program, and if so, under what authority?
Senator, I'd prefer not to talk about a hypothetical case like that. I think that this is an issue that we've seen discussed here on the Hill. Certainly, we've looked at the AUMF authority in another venue. We've looked at the War Powers Act, was a previous generation ago effort to come to grips with this issue. But I would say right now, everything that we are doing, and you can see it with Korea, you can see it with how long it took for us to make the decision on this issue. We're diplomatically led on this. We're not talking about any default to war as the binary choice. We're going back into working with allies, working with the international community, United Nations, with Ambassador Haley, and working this issue forward.
Yeah, well, I'm very pleased to hear that of considering the diplomatic options, but I think it's pretty clear, and I won't get you into the hypothetical, that unless there's an imminent threat, I don't think the President can order that. I think he has to come to the Congress. The President's national security, and this is what concerns me, as I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the people that surround him. President's National Security Advisor John Bolton published an op-ed in the New York Times just over 3 years ago titled, "To Stop Iran's Bomb, Bomb Iran." If the U.S. were to use force to stop an Iranian nuclear weapons program, we must consider the most likely second and third order impacts, how Iran and other nations would respond to such escalation or how such attack could lead to other actions in the region. Following the experience in Iraq, can the Department of Defense be confident that such an action would be limited to airstrikes and avoid another ground war involving U.S. troops in the Middle East?
Senator, I have had numerous conversations in the last 2 or 3 weeks with Mr. Bolton. This issue, as characterized by his article that you quoted there, has not even arisen. There is, as we all recognize, a sobering aspect of being in the positions that he and I occupy.
Yeah, thank you. The National Security Advisor Bolton's 2015 op-ed also advocated a U.S. policy of regime change for Iran. Rudolph Giuliani is now the President's attorney and recently made public remarks in support of regime change for Iran. Does the United States have a policy of regime change for Iran? And if so, what actions does the President intend to take to implement that policy?
Senator, as you know, our problem with Iran is not with the Iranian people. It is with the regime that holds them captive, basically, to the activities they've conducted. But I would let Mr. Bolton and Mr. Giuliani speak for themselves, sir. I'd prefer not to comment on that and let them speak for themselves.
Thank you. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee meet this month to debate and update the AUMF to replace the 9/11 AUMF and the Iraq War AUMF. I hope that your team has compared the new Senate language, which Chairman Corker released last month, with the existing authorities. My reading of the new AUMF is that it authorizes force against al-Qaeda and ISIL and some named associate forces, but it does not authorize force against the Syrian government or against the Iranian government. Do you agree with that reading? Would you commit to providing the Department of Defense and a Department of Defense analysis of the proposed updated AUMF prior to the committee markup, which may occur in 2 weeks? We'd really appreciate having your input into this, seeing how important it is.
Senator, I've worked with the two senators who are involved with this, and the White House is working with them. We have been, I think, heard well, but let me get back to the White House and see where the interagency is on this. State Department's important, obviously, in an event like this or in an issue like this, because we try to keep the U.S. military and the Defense Department in a reinforcing role to State Department's lead on foreign policy, where we belong and where I think we're strongest. But we'll get back to you, Senator, on this.
The important thing, and I think we have emphasized this with Chairman Corker, is that if he's going to go forward with a markup of the proposal that's out there, before we do that, that we actually have a hearing where we can hear from all the individuals you talked about, and in addition have another panel which would be outside experts to talk about what this means. It seems that if we're going to really head down the road of a new and updated AUMF, that the administration needs to take a strong position where they are on it, and in addition, outside experts look at it. And I notice, and I'll put this one in for the record, but the administration, as you know, the last administration, when it was going to bomb in Syria, asked for Congress's permission to do so, and it didn't get it. And does this administration consider the use of chemical weapons anywhere in the world as a legal basis for U.S. military force without a vote in Congress? It seems to me this is a big issue, the difference in administrations, and so I'll put it for the record. I know, Secretary Mattis, how thoughtful you are, and you really think these things out, and so I'd appreciate a good, thoughtful answer on that one. Thank you very much.
Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm honored to be here with you, Secretary Mattis, General Dunford. I'm very pleased to see that President Trump's budget submissions are strategy-based. They establish a foundation for rebuilding the U.S. military into a more capable, a more lethal, and a ready joint force. It's very clear to me that our Department of Defense is focused on what matters most, and that's keeping Americans safe. And I want to thank you for your leadership in that regard. And having spent a fair amount of time over in Asia, worked over there in a previous life, and just in the last 30 days, some meetings there with some of our allies, the peace through strength doctrine that I really think you've brought back here from the days of President Reagan, it's working. And by keeping all options on the table, as you have regarding North Korea, we have a window of opportunity now that we've not seen arguably in a generation. And I want to thank you for your leadership. It's remarkable to hear the news this morning that 3 American detainees are on their way home. That's not by accident. And you ought to be commended for the important work the U.S. military has done by keeping all options on the table to drive Kim Jong-un here to a reasonable outcome in this dilemma here, which is a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Earlier this year, the Department of Defense released its updated national defense strategy, which acknowledges the reemergence of a long-term strategic competition. After years of focused attention on conflicts abroad, this strategy is distinct in that it prioritizes defense of the homeland. Secretary Mattis, defense of the homeland is a core competency for our National Guard. What measures is the department taking to address some critical readiness shortfalls that we see in our Guard, such as the UH-60 Black Hawk and the AH-64 Apache.
Senator, I think I'm going to have to take that for the record. I know that we are upgrading and we're shifting airframes in certain places, but I'd better, do you have it with you, David?
I don't have a specific.
All right, yeah, let us take that for the record so we can be specific. If it's those two helicopters you're concerned with, we can probably get you an answer, I'd say, within the week.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. I just recently returned from leading a CODEL to China. In fact, I brought 4 U.S. senators with me the last 30 days where we were assessing the threats as well as the opportunities of our engagement with China. It was readily apparent to the delegation after spending a week there. This leads me to believe that very real threats that China poses to our national security and that they need to be addressed directly, whether it's their military investments, the economic development via forced technology transfers, outright theft, or China's rapidly developing and innovative tech sector. The time has passed where the U.S. can be complacent. Secretary Mattis, how can we best impose effective export controls and other means to protect U.S. interests and our innovation while not unduly impeding foreign direct investment for both our friends and our allies?
Right, and that's the rub right there, that last phrase, sir. I think right now what Senator Cornyn is leading in terms of the CFIUS and the how do we protect certain industries here in the country, certain research and development that truly are critical to what we need for national defense. That is part of it, but we don't want to do this in a way that basically takes a sledgehammer to handle something that's got to be more delicately addressed, more directly fine-tuned. So we're going to have to work closely with you because there are some areas that I see democracies from Australia to Europe, Canada, all working to protect. And it's interesting that the nations taking the most active role in this are some of the most populous democracies right now. And so we all recognize that intellectual property theft is an issue that China is going to have to address if they want to be treated as an equal in terms of foreign investment in other firms. I think one of the reasons why we're looking at certain sanctions right now, certain tariffs and all, are as a result of this very issue. So we're looking at it with a host of different initiatives, but they've got to be done with a fair degree of fidelity or we're going to actually run afoul of that last point where we're penalizing ourselves rather than protecting ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you look at virtually every probably Fortune 100 company or Fortune 500 company has the growth in China, and our ability to supply those opportunities is an important part of our overall growth for our American businesses. At the same time, it's become more and more clear to me that China is a fierce competitor in the development of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and that's of course, the walk of wisdom that's going to take here as we sort that out. Despite this, I tell you, I'm confident the department recognizes those challenges. I hear it from you, and it's a very thoughtful response, and that you're moving aggressively to maintain our competitive edge as well, both from a commercial viewpoint and, importantly, from a military viewpoint. Nonetheless, one area the Chinese are outpacing us is actually in the mining of critical materials and critical minerals. I understand these minerals are the building blocks for most of our military equipment, and without access to them, our most advanced weapons systems would be rendered useless. Additionally, Defense News recently published that our dependence on China as a sole provider for at least 20 of these minerals makes this a strategic vulnerability that poses a significant risk to our country's national security. Secretary Mattis, would you share any thoughts, or could you elaborate on what the Department of Defense is doing to mitigate the strategic vulnerability caused by our dependence on China for critical minerals which are used in our most advanced weapon systems.
Yes, sir. Senator, what we've got going on right now is an interagency effort with Department of Defense at the main table there, Undersecretary Ellen Lord and one of her key subordinates who focuses on nothing but this issue, working with Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, Department of State, as we look at how do we solve the problem. In other words, identify the problem, solve it. There's a number of different efforts underway. We're looking at putting together a program, a strategy basically, that addresses all these vulnerabilities. In some cases, technology can lessen our dependence on certain key elements. In other cases, there are other locations which are perhaps more costly for extraction, but they would work as a reserve. Certainly, we can look at a strategic stockpile as well for certain things. So there's the process is underway, I can tell you that. I can't give you the output right now, and I don't think even if I had the work that they've done, I could give you full answers, but I will assure you that this is getting full attention.
I'm out of time, Mr. Secretary, but I just want to let you know, please let this committee know how Congress might assist you in that effort as you develop the strategy and next steps. This is playing the long game here, but that's an important strategy we need to lay out here as it relates to ensuring that we keep the homeland safe. Thank you.
Well, there's 1,800 reports a year that I'm required to submit. I may just add one to it, sir, and, on my own and report this back to you about where we're at on this issue.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary and General, for your service and for being here as we have this year's hearing on the Defense Department budget. General Dunford, as part of last year's hearing on the Defense Department budget, I asked you, for the record, whether it was in the U.S. interest to continue implementing the Iran nuclear agreement, and what were the risks to the U.S. And our national security and our allies' security if the agreement were scrapped. You responded in July of 2017 saying, and here I will quote, "I believe it is in the nation's interest to continue implementing the Iran nuclear agreement. Militarily, the JCPOA remains the most durable means of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. If the United States scraps the deal, Iran could respond by restarting its quest for nuclear weapons. A nuclear-armed Iran would further destabilize the entire Middle East and could precipitate a regional nuclear arms race or regional war." Your response was and remains consistent with the positions of other U.S. military and intelligence leaders, including the consensus that Iran is in compliance with the agreement. For example, last month you told the House Armed Services Committee that you were not aware of any violations. General Dunford, is your response from July 2017 still your professional military judgment?
Senator, I think you probably, as you understand, my job really is to support the policy. So the president has changed the policy. Iran has a nuclear challenge, and as the Secretary outlined earlier, a maritime challenge, a cyber challenge, the support of proxies in the region as well. And so my job now is to adjust to that reality and make sure that I'm supporting the president's policy and in the development or potential development of nuclear weapons by Iran.
But I think it's also true that your job involves giving us your best, and the president, your best professional military judgment. Has your judgment changed since you wrote that response?
Senator, if I could, in the civilian control, the military point here, this took us over a year as we dealt with it on the interagency. You saw it was not a hasty decision immediately after inauguration. And I can assure you that the chairman and I were given full hearing. It was a rigorous debate. It went over many, many months. And you've seen it in the news as certain affirmations had to be made to the Congress by the president. And he got to a point where he just did not see that this was in our best interest to continue. It had to do with all the other things that Iran is certainly doing, from supporting Assad to supporting proxies, attacking Saudi Arabia, and fomenting the problem down in Yemen. So all of this had to be mixed together, and separate out what the chairman's or my advice was on our area. It had to be leavened with foreign policy concerned out of state, intel assessments of where they're at today and where they're going. So I just want to be just completely candid with you on that.
No, I understand, and you know, there's whether you base it on violations, which I don't think any of our leaders identified, or the interests of the nation. I want to understand whether professional military judgment has changed since last year. But let me move on to a different topic. Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, to meet the strategic challenge posed by China, we need to ensure that our national security policies also strengthen our economic security. In the DoD context, this means strengthening our defense industrial base. Like President Trump, I believe it is best accomplished through robust Buy America policies. For example, earlier this month, I introduced the Made in America Shipbuilding Act, which requires that all ships purchased by the federal government, regardless of the agency or class, be made in America with U.S. materials and U.S. shipboard components. This bill will strengthen the industrial base, level the playing field for suppliers, and grow skilled manufacturing jobs. But it will also help secure defense supply chains at a time of increased global insecurity and instability by eliminating U.S. reliance on foreign corporations and components. Can both of you provide your views on the importance of Buy America policies to our defense industrial base, the national security implications of not having reliable access to critical supplies and aftermarket support, and the dangers posed by counterfeit parts and adversarial nations using DoD supply chains for industrial espionage and technology transfer?
Yes, Senator. The defense industrial base has shrunk over the years since the Cold War. We all recognize it. But there comes a point where preservation of it is critical. You cannot barter it away. There is no more room to reduce it at a certain point. And I think the Made in America effort is a very valid national security concern. Now, at the same time, if there's allies that are as committed to defense of democracy and we're in alliances with them, there may be some room for back and forth. We've done that before. As you know, the Marine Harrier jet came out of England when it was first started. But I think, too, that critical supplies and certainly having faulty or counterfeit parts, these two actually go hand in hand, these two issues. And this is why I think the earlier question about how do we protect intellectual property, how do we look at what other nations should be allowed to invest in, I think it's an appropriate issue for the Congress to take in hand, and I think it's appropriate for you to ask us at what point do we see problems, strategic vulnerabilities. And we can provide that information to you. Again, Undersecretary Ellen Lord is leading this effort, but we've got a lot of other people helping, and she has some members of her staff who do nothing but this issue. So we can give any kind of further detail, but I would just say I'm completely aligned with the themes as you outline them.
Thank you. General Dunford.
Senator, in my opening remarks, I spoke about competitive advantage, and I said that I have confidence today that we have a competitive advantage over any potential adversary. And I don't think you can understate the importance of the industrial base in the United States to that competitive advantage. So I think what you're alluding to are both the qualitative implications of leveraging the U.S. industrial base. We are always in front of everybody else, in part because of our education system and the quality of our workers. And then the other important point you pointed out was the security. Obviously, our relationships with nations that fall under laws within the United States makes it much easier for us to protect intellectual property and make sure that we do maintain that competitive advantage.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary and General Dunford, we appreciate your appearance before the committee today. Other senators may submit additional written questions to you, and if they do, I hope you will be able to respond to them within 30 days. And subject to all that, the Defense Subcommittee will reconvene next Tuesday, May the 15th at 10 a.m. to receive testimony from the United States Army. Thank you, gentlemen.